along with my wife, Melissa Muscatine, and we are very, very excited and honored to be hosting the New Yorker writer, Evan Osnos, who's here to talk about his new book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultrarich. Evan's he's a great reporter and a great writer, and an example, and he's an example of how when you're a talented journalist with understanding editors, you can often create your own beat to cover. In his case, he was supposed to be covering, at least officially, this is what his beat is, politics and foreign affairs for the New Yorker. But he's tweaked that a bit in recent years to root around in the enclaves of the well-off and pursue an area of coverage that could be called the lives of the rich and very rich and their impact on the rest of us. Early on in his career, Evan had a very distinguished run as a foreign correspondent, starting in the Middle East for the Chicago Tribune, and then in China for the Trib, and in 2008, he shared a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. That year, he also joined the New Yorker and stayed in China for several more years before coming back to the United States and settling here in Washington. He wrote an excellent book about China, Age of Ambition, that won the 2014 National Book Award, and his biography of Joe Biden in 2020 was both well-timed and well-received. But already by then, Evan was showing an interest in reporting not just on the regular goings-on of politics and foreign affairs, but on matters of wealth and class and how our political and social landscapes were being reshaped. His 2021 book, Wildland, insightfully explored the political fragmentation and polarization in the United States as seen from the alarmed middle ranks of the country, from places like Appalachia and the south side of Chicago. His new book is, as he says in the introduction, a view from the top, a kind of field guide, he calls it, to the ultra-rich. While Evan himself didn't come from enormous wealth, his parents are sitting right here, actually. His family was fortunate enough to move into the house of Evan's grandmother in Greenwich, Connecticut, when Evan was in 6th grade, so he became an observer early on of the forces of wealth and power. He clearly has relished writing pieces from the New Yorker on such matters as outrageously luxurious super yachts, lavish survivalist bunkers intended to ride out the apocalypse in style, private parties for kids featuring pop stars for entertainment, and private wealth managers who practice tax avoidance on a grand scale. These and other essays written first for the New Yorker and now revised and expanded are collected in Evan's new book and arranged in 3 sections entitled The Rewards, the Mechanics, and the Perils. Evan is too much the professional journalist to pass judgment on his subjects, but he knows how to marshal evidence in a way that's, shall we say, often self-incriminating. And running through his stories is a wit and light touch that will leave you entertained while at the same time appalled by the excesses of the ultra-rich. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Evan Osnos.
Well, I have to say that I think as many authors know, having a book event at Politics and Prose is like having a bar mitzvah for your book. It's where you know that your book has finally arrived. So it is a total treat to be back here tonight. And thank you to all of you for coming out on this cool, crisp evening. I appreciate it. As Brad suggested a moment ago, it's a fair question to ask why a writer on politics and foreign affairs might have a book with yachts in the title. The answer is that reporting can lead you to some surprising destinations. One day not too long ago, I found myself standing on the deck of a super yacht on the coast of Tuscany. By the way, hardship pay has not been forthcoming, I've noticed. But there I was, was a cloudless morning in Livorno, which is an Italian town that first got into the ship business by building the giant boats that would carry the marble from the Carrara quarries. Then later, during World War II, they built naval vessels, and they now apply those skills to making some of the world's largest super yachts. These are boats that are as long as a football field, as long as a city block. They cost the better part of $1 billion. The largest of them are called giga-yachts, and they are the priciest objects that human beings have ever figured out how to own, pricier even than history's most expensive work of art, which you'll recall was Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, which, not incidentally, now hangs on the wall of a giga-yacht that belongs to Mohammed bin Sultan of Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't always like this, I have to tell you. In the Victorian age, there was a saying that the length of a man's boat in feet should match his age in years. I think the Victorians would have a few sharp questions for the Saudi crown prince, who is not yet 40 years old and has a boat that is 439 feet long. Now, in fairness, it's been a while since the Victorians. During the 1960s, Aristotle Onassis had a famous yacht called Christina O that had some memorable flourishes, including a swimming pool that rose up to become a dance floor, and bar stools that were made out of whale foreskins. And yes, you heard that correctly. By the way, whales hate that story. Now, these days, you may or may not know, if it hasn't touched your life personally, that we are living through what the yacht industry calls the greatest boom in the history of the business. In 1990, there were fewer than 10 of these giant giga-yachts in the world. Today, there are more than 170, alongside another 5,000 or so ordinary super yachts, if we can call them that. In fact, the smaller ones are now dwarfed so much by these leviathans that the smaller ones have become known recently in the trade as pocket yachts. And that's because, in the end, the essential metric of that world is what's known as LOA, which stands for length overall. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that this boom in the superyacht business tracks perfectly the era of widening inequality. As the boats got bigger, the people got richer. Since 1990, the number of billionaires in America has jumped from 66 to more than 800, while the median hourly wage in this country has risen barely 20%. In fact, the ultra-rich today hold more of the nation's wealth than the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers did in their heyday a century ago. And yet fully half of American adults today tell you that they can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense. A decade ago, there was nobody on the planet who was worth $100 billion. Today, there are 15 so-called centibillionaires. And in fact, if we continue on this track, in the next 10 or 15 years, we're going to be living in the land of the first trillionaire. It won't surprise you to hear that the leading candidate for that is somebody who 10 years ago, Elon Musk, had $10 billion. Today, he has $400 billion. Scholars who study inequality back to the Neolithic era will tell you that we are in uncharted territory. The archaeologist Tim Carrick said recently, the people who built the Egyptian pyramids were probably in a less unequal society. In that sense, I'm here to tell you it is not your imagination. The sheer growth of these fortunes has swamped our laws and our institutions. It's reshaping our lives faster than politics, culture, and even in some ways, our psychology can adapt. There's a very long history of American writing about fortunes gained and lost, about how money can change you, but first, really, it will reveal you. When Mark Twain was growing up in the 19th century, there were just a handful of millionaires in this country. By the end of the century, there were 20,000. He coined the phrase, the Gilded Age, to convey the idea of a time of superficial splendor, when there was a tremendous amount of money in the hands of very few, but massive inequality in this country. And it was a phrase that was on my mind, as it might have been on yours, earlier this year, in fact, on January 20th, 2025. As I watched that scene of the president being sworn in on a stage with so many billionaires beside him, that there wasn't even room for the members of Congress who'd been elected to represent the people of the United States. They were relegated to the audience. Over the years, as I've worked on this subject, I've come to see certain patterns, which I think might illuminate not just the lives of some of America's most powerful people, but also perhaps a larger portrait of society itself. Things like how the technologies of influence shape what we see and hear and believe. How the stresses of inequality wear at us not only at the middle and at the bottom of the income ladder, but also at the top. In 1965, the CEOs of large American companies earned, on average, 20 times what frontline workers earned. Since then, that ratio has ballooned to 300 or 400 to 1. New data just out 2 weeks ago shows it's now 350 to 1. And that divide has pried us apart in deeper ways. I've often reported in West Virginia over the years. I moved there right out of college from my first job at a little newspaper, and I've returned periodically to gauge the mood in parts of the country that don't get written about enough. Recently, I've been thinking about a comment that a coal miner named David Efaw mentioned to me. He'd heard about the CEO of a company who was making about 400 times what the frontline workers were making, and he said, "Is there any man really worth 400 or 500 other men? I've never met one," he said. I started reporting in earnest about wealth and class in 2016, it won't shock you, when the Donald Trump's election really confounded, I think, our usual instruments for trying to understand the changes in this country. I'd written about him as a political figure, I still do, but it became quite clear to me that if we really wanted to grasp the changes that he represented in this country, how a voter, for instance, might revile the elite while also revering the scion of a real estate fortune from New York City, that we had to look beyond politics, because Trump, after all, is a creature fundamentally of the money world, and specifically of a period of American thinking about some big ideas around success and greed, around fairness and liberty, around dignity and dominance. And the essays in this book have been written against a backdrop over the last 8 years of immense contrast, of rising homelessness, of environmental peril, and most recently, perhaps, of a dawning awareness of how the coming changes in technology are going to reverberate through our lives, our income, our children's lives, our wealth, and ultimately our sense of meaning. But you can't understand how this country feels about the ultra-rich unless you keep two of the following thoughts in your head at the same time. Look at any poll and you'll find a version of this one from last year. 59% of Americans say that billionaires are making society more unfair, and a nearly identical number of Americans say they hope to become a billionaire themselves. In fact, in some cases, it's the same people giving that answer. That very coal miner that I mentioned to you a moment ago also told me that he voted for Trump because, he explained, Trump promised to bring back the coal mining industry, and nobody else had made him that promise. In his way, David Efaw had illuminated, I think, an essential puzzle that really runs through the pages of this book, which is, do Americans want to eat the rich or join them at the table? All of this is to explain how a writer, frankly, who can barely swim, doesn't find himself quite naturally in an Italian shipyard filled with giant yachts as far as the eye can see. So as I took in that scene, they started to look to me like symbols of our era, an era of extremes and of excesses, but also they started to look like artifacts in the making. I started to imagine some future civilization sifting through the sediment and discovering that an earlier society had built these sumptuous arks. And they'd wonder, what were these objects? What did they mean to the people who wanted them? Perhaps most importantly, what did they tell us about the society that created them? If it's okay, I'd like to read just a couple of sentences from the book to frame how it can feel inside that world. I have them on here. In the following scene, I'm describing my visit to the Yacht Club of Monaco. Again, no hazard pay as far as I can tell, which sits at the harbor's edge in Monaco and is styled in the manner of a giant, luxurious vessel. As soon as I set foot in my cabin, I quickly came to understand that I would never be fully satisfied anywhere else again. The next morning, I was on my terrace enjoying the latest delivery from the service members, an airy French omelet and a glass of preternaturally fresh orange juice. I thought guiltily of my wife at home with our kids, who had sent a text overnight alerting me to a maintenance issue that she described as a toilet debacle. But then I was distracted by the sight of a man on a yacht in the marina below. He was staring up at me. I went back to my brunch, but when I looked again, there he was, a middle-aged man on a mid-tier yacht, juiceless on a grayish banquette, staring up at my perfect terrace. A surprising sensation started in my chest and moved outward like a warm glow, the unmistakable pang of superiority. It's moments like that that make me wonder, and perhaps you're all wondering by now, how did we land in the era of the haves and the have-yachts? How much ultimately is too much, or rather, how much is never enough? To answer these questions, I'm going to tell you about a few people I've come to know. Some you've heard of, and some you almost certainly have not. But I think in their experiences, I suspect we might begin to see some lessons about this era of very big money, specifically how it's spent, how it's made, and how it's lost, and what it means for the rest of us. So how does someone who can afford anything really choose to spend it? Well, the more time that I've interviewed some of these new tycoons of Silicon Valley, the more I've noticed that their spending can sometimes reveal less about the world that they're trying to join than it does about the world they're trying to escape. Steve Huffman, who is the co-founder and CEO of Reddit, told me that he had been nearsighted until he arranged to have laser eye surgery, not for the sake of convenience or appearance, but because it's for a reason that he doesn't usually talk much about, which is that he hopes it will improve his odds of surviving a disaster, whether natural or man-made. He told me, if the world ends, and not even if the world ends, but if we have trouble, he said, getting contacts or glasses is going to be a huge pain. He said, without them, I'm effed. Huffman worries about what he calls the temporary collapse of our government and structures, about the risk of large-scale unrest in this country. He told me, I own a couple of motorcycles. I have a bunch of guns and ammo, food. I figure that with that, I can hole up in my house for some amount of time, unquote. And it's not just Steve Huffman. Survivalism, the preparation for a crack-up of civilization, either because of civil war or terrorism or something like it, has been expanding in affluent quarters, taking root in Silicon Valley and New York City, among technology executives, hedge fund managers, and others in that economic cohort. The head of an investment firm in California told me that he keeps a helicopter gassed up all the time, and I have an underground bunker with an air filtration system, unquote. Others told me about their remote getaways in New Zealand and about learning archery and stockpiling cryptocurrency and passports. If you're starting to feel frantic right now, I can understand why. To get a feel for it, I spent a night in a luxury bunker built into a converted nuclear missile silo beneath the Kansas prairie at an undisclosed location. The walls are equipped with LED windows that are programmed to show beautiful pine forests, or video, in fact, of Central Park with all of the sounds of birds and taxis and honking horns. And by the way, like any high-end real estate, there's a little bit of drama there. One of the co-owners, who usually lives in Bermuda, ordered the walls of his bunker to be painted in bright island colors of orange and green and yellow, but everybody found it totally oppressive, and he had to bring in his decorator to fix it. All of this to prepare for the kind of world that's known in doomsday prepper circles as WROL, which stands for a world without rule of law. Some of these wealthy preppers told me that they were inspired by the toxic political divisions revealed by the 2016 election and what's followed. Others worry that if artificial intelligence takes away jobs, that there will be a backlash against Silicon Valley. A former Facebook product manager told me that he was stockpiling ammunition on an island in the Pacific Northwest because he said, I think people who are particularly attuned to the levers by which society actually works understand that we're skating on really thin cultural ice right now, unquote. In the case of Huffman, the CEO of Reddit, his position, in fact, makes him especially aware of the ways that technology alters our relationships with one another, for better and for worse. Long before the financial crisis became front-page news in 2008, he already started to see the rumors, the sense of unease, the disquiet popping up in the comments on his own platform. And one sign of how far this kind of survivalist thinking has spread is that some in Silicon Valley, if you can believe it, are now speaking out against it. Max Levchin, one of the founders of PayPal, told me, "It's one of the few things about Silicon Valley that I actively dislike. The sense that we're superior giants who move the needle, and even if it's our own failure, must be spared." In Levchin's view, prepping for survival is a moral miscalculation. He said, "I typically ask people, so you're worried about the pitchforks? Well, how much money have you donated to your local homeless shelter?" All of this discussion can make you wonder, as it did make me wonder, how did a preoccupation with the apocalypse come to flourish in Silicon Valley, which is, after all, a place known to the point of cliche for unstinting confidence in its ability to change the world for the better? Well, part of the answer is that extreme inequality has a way of unnerving people at the top. One Wall Street veteran mentioned to me a statistic, which some of you may know, which is that 25 hedge fund managers in this country make more money than all of the kindergarten teachers combined. He said being one of those 25 doesn't feel good. Perhaps the clearest expression of that sensitivity comes to us from a yacht owner named Bill Duker, who said not long ago, quote, "If the rest of the world learns what it's like to live on a yacht like this, they're going to bring back the guillotine," unquote. Over time, I've come to see this sensitivity as a kind of vertigo, a feeling of precarious exposure, a knowledge, perhaps, that the very fortunes that have lifted them into the stratosphere also make them vulnerable to be targeted, perhaps by a public backlash, or, let's face it, perhaps by the vengeance of a president who is interested in a world without rule of law of his own, perhaps a president who seeks to tether their power to his. Watching the inauguration scene, I got the sense that the billionaires lined up beside Trump occupied various points on a spectrum, everything from enthusiastic to uneasy, perhaps even a bit fearful in some cases. Now, fear, of course, can be healthy if it spurs an action to address the source of it. But elite survivalism is hardly a step toward prevention. Rather, it's an act of withdrawal. I've come to see it as a quiet disinvestment by some of America's most successful and powerful people. It tells us not only about how some people choose to spend their wealth, but also about the values that drive them and the companies that built that wealth in the first place. What are the motives that drive someone to climb to that height and then to keep climbing? How do the people at the center of this era see their own ambition in relation to the rest of the country and in relation to history? Well, that brings me to the second person I want to tell you about tonight. A few years ago, I was interviewing Mark Zuckerberg in his living room, and I noticed a large pile of board games sitting there on the coffee table. He's an intense board game player. A former colleague told me, "Mark doesn't just play you in a game of Risk, he's playing you in a game of games," in effect modeling your mind to anticipate your moves. Another source recounted a flight on a private jet where Zuckerberg played Scrabble against the daughter of some friends, a high school student. And after the teenager won the first game, Zuckerberg wrote a simple computer program that let him look up all his tiles in the dictionary to come up with all conceivable combinations. And eventually, other people on the plane started to crowd around to watch, and they named the competition Team Human versus Team Machine. I talked to Zuckerberg several times over several months, and I wanted to understand most of all his perception of his own role in society, the opportunities and the obligations that come with extraordinary power. He presides, let's remind ourselves, over a company so vast that it has no precedent in American enterprise. In fact, it has more adherents than Christianity. The scale and impact appeals to him. He has a lifelong fascination with ancient Rome, having learned Latin and become fascinated by figures like Caesar Augustus. So fascinated, in fact, that when he went on his honeymoon to Rome, he and his wife returned with so many pictures of them with statues of Augustus that she began to joke that it looked like the three of them were in that marriage. By the way, they went on to name all of their children after Roman emperors. A side note here for non-classics majors, Augustus Caesar took power at age 18. He transformed Rome from a republic into an empire by conquering Egypt, large parts of Europe. He also eliminated political opponents. He banished his daughter for promiscuity and was suspected of arranging his grandson's execution. Now, when Zuckerberg described that legacy to me, he put it this way. He said, through a really harsh approach, he established 200 years of world peace. He asked, what are the trade-offs in that? World peace didn't come for free. He had to do certain things. Now, in his own less dramatic realm, Zuckerberg has already accumulated the power to alter history with a click. When the company experimented with a button that said, I voted, it discovered that it could produce an astonishing 340,000 additional votes, a larger margin than the difference between presidential candidates in certain states. This was a sign of extraordinary new influence, not only in the lives of their customers, but even in people who aren't their customers, an influence in the very balance of democracy itself. Now, history tells us that extraordinary scale can destabilize the mechanics of democracy. In 1915, it's worth reminding ourselves, Louis Brandeis, who went on to become a Supreme Court justice, warned of business fortunes, as he put it, so powerful that the ordinary social and industrial forces existing are insufficient to cope with it. He named this the curse of bigness. Now, initially, Zuckerberg enjoyed the power that came with that size, but his reputation, as you know, has frayed around issues of privacy and democracy and mental health. And in fact, some of the most searing descriptions come from former Facebook insiders themselves. Sean Parker, who'd been the company's first president, took to calling himself a conscientious objector to social media, saying, quote, God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. The company made changes to try to respond to public criticism, but it really couldn't solve a puzzle that grew out of its own relentless focus on growth. How prepared is Zuckerberg, or any individual for that matter, to be the arbiter for 2 billion people of some of the subtle matters of human affairs, including the definitions of truth, the origins of violence, the transmission of hate? Zuckerberg, after all, has spent nearly half his life in a self-made company, handpicking his lieutenants, sculpting the world around him. And there's no matter how much he might try to approximate the experience and the interests of others, he finds himself increasingly removed. In fact, he functions in a world that is sculpted to his own preferences. Consider one minor, but I think quite revealing detail. Zuckerberg chose Facebook's signature royal blue color because he is red-green colorblind, so he sees blue most vividly. In other words, he created a world that quite literally fits his perceptions and avoids his blind spots. But what does it mean for the rest of us when a billionaire's blind spots are larger than matters of design? The founding motto, move fast and break things, has exacted a steep toll on the offline world, or what we might call Team Human. Like Augustus, Zuckerberg has made his trade-offs over the years. Between speed and caution, he chose speed. Between scale and safety, he chose scale. The habits of mind that helped him reach that pinnacle eventually started to work against him. He still sees himself as a disruptor, but his colossal powers of influence in all of our lives put him in a permanent state of tension with his own obligations to society and democracy. It's no surprise, perhaps, that, as you may have read not long ago, he's built a compound in Hawaii, reportedly complete with a 5,000-foot underground shelter that can survive a disaster with its own energy and food supplies. More than a century after Brandeis warned of the curse of bigness, no slice of American life, I think, exemplifies more clearly that risk to democracy than the companies represented on that inauguration stage in January of 2025. Rarely has there been a more explicitly clear moment than when the richest man in the world wrote recently on his own social media network that he spent $300 million on an election, and then, as he put it, quote, without me, Trump would have lost the election. As the saying goes in this case, the scandal is not what's illegal. The scandal is what's legal. With so much power to build and defend your empire, I think it's tempting to wonder why more than a few have-yachts end up losing it by one route or another. The former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, who prosecuted many white-collar cases, told me recently that wealthy defendants often defend themselves with a fascinating question. They say, I'm already rich, so why would I do what you're accusing me of? It's a decent question, actually. And that very question, I have to say, occupies the last section of my book and of my comments tonight. Since a lot of you have not read the book, I won't spoil some of the sagas that unfold there. But what is so interesting is how stories of spectacular deception can show us what happens to very human instincts under very unusual circumstances of opportunity, of power, and of insatiability. Which brings me to the last of the three people I want to talk to you about, and his name is Jeffrey D. Grant. In the 1990s, Jeff Grant was in his early 40s. He was doing very well. He ran his own law firm with big clients in New York City. He was a co-owner of a bistro called The Good Life. He loved his work, and he loved the fortune that it produced. Each year, he took his wife and his daughters on a half a dozen shopping vacations, as they called them. So often, in fact, that they sometimes neglected to open the bags between trips. As a lawyer, he specialized in real estate and corporate work, and he saw himself, to use his word, as an assassin. He said, in business and out of it, his philosophy was, he told me, win, win, win. Now, Grant moved to my hometown, Greenwich, Connecticut, home of the Bush political dynasty, home to captains of industry and finance. But by that point, he was already starting to unravel. Part of it was physical. He had torn his Achilles tendon playing basketball one day, and as you might imagine, this is where it's going. He developed an addiction, first to Demerol and then to OxyContin. But he was also becoming addicted to something else, to a certain kind of thinking, a kind of grandiosity, of a grandiose self-confidence. He was betting more and more of his money on technology stocks, and when he bet wrong, he ended up in debt. And that's when he crossed a very bright line in his story, a line you don't come back from. He started taking money from his clients' escrow accounts. What's worse, after 9/11, he applied for a disaster relief loan from the Small Business Administration, claiming to have lost the use of an office near Ground Zero. But there was no office. That was a lie. And when the IRS figured it out, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and he pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering, and on Easter Sunday, he drove from Greenwich, Connecticut, to federal prison in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. He served 14 months, and he came home with absolutely no idea what he was going to do next. He'd been disbarred. He'd been cut off from his old world, and that, he will tell you, is what saved his life. Because he was in the midst of a kind of transformation, an awakening of a certain kind, what Brian Stevenson, the great lawyer, calls a chance to get proximate, to step outside the confines of our own usual lives, our own secluded daily experiences. Grant, let's face it, had gotten a little more proximate to prison and the struggles of ordinary folks than he might have ever wanted, but it was also changing him. After prison, he started volunteering at rehab facilities, at the places that had helped him get sober. Then he joined the board of a nonprofit. He became the executive director. And then eventually, in fact, he started studying for a divinity degree at Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan. Bit by bit, he was starting to understand something about himself, which is that the problems in his life did not begin with lying on a loan application or even with an addiction to painkillers. They sprang from something much deeper and I think much more widely felt in our society. And that's a dangerous flaw in how we think about winning. The instinct, as he put it, to win, 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 even going so far as to break the rules in order to ensure that the winners keep winning. And of course, he's hardly alone in that practice. In the past quarter century, we've lived through something of a golden age of elite financial scandal, which has revealed the ways that some people break the rules even when they might seem to have it all. To give you just one memorable data point, after the accounting scandals at Enron and other companies, CFO Magazine had to abandon its annual Excellence Awards because the winners from each of the previous 3 years had gone to prison. A famous investor named John Bogle, who invented the modern mutual fund, looked at his own industry and said, when I came into this field 6 decades ago, the standard seemed to be there are some things that one simply doesn't do. Today, he said, the standard is if everyone else is doing it, I can do it too. And that sensibility is exactly what Jeff Grant has set out to beat back in some small way. He now works again as a lawyer, but also as a minister and a counselor, offering what he calls ethics rehab for people who have lost sight of what it really means to be successful. He's created, if you can believe it, a support group for white-collar criminals, for guys, as he puts it, detoxing from power and influence. And after we'd known each other for a while, Jeff let me sit in on that support group for white-collar criminals. It's a scene that I describe in this book. But back here in Washington, I often think about the story of Jeff Grant because he is asking himself, and in a sense asking the rest of us, to reconsider what it takes to get to the top of the heap in American life today. What are the values that we venerate, that we amplify, and what does it take to change them? In one form or another, the stories that I've shared tonight describe, I think, what happens, both to individuals and ultimately to society, when wealth grows at a scale and a speed that we've rarely confronted before. As that archaeologist Tim Carrick put it to me, the economic and technical evolution is much faster than the social, mental, and ideological evolution. In other words, he said, our law and our institutions and our culture have not adapted to such giant fortunes. And as we brace for another big leap in technology with the transformations brought by artificial intelligence, it may well tilt the balance further away from team human towards team machine. As I worked on this book, it's been tempting, I'll admit, to wonder if America is approaching a point of untenable imbalance, a pattern that we see repeated across the ages. Near the end of the Roman Empire, in the 4th century AD, inequality was so severe that a typical Roman farmer earned about 5 pieces of gold a year, while a Roman senator could earn 120,000. The fall of Rome took 500 years, but as the historian Ramsay MacMullen once wrote, it could be compressed into 3 words: fewer have more. In our final moments here, I have some good news to share, and you deserve it. You've been very stoic. The good news is that we've actually faced some similar questions in our history, and in fact have succeeded at times in turning the boat, as it were, away from the rocky shoals. At the start of the 20th century, Americans were in a very similar condition. We were marveling at all these new technologies, the typewriter, the telephone, the elevator, at the very moment that the lifespans of the poorest Americans were shortening. It was the deaths of despair of its own time. At the time, people were protesting low wages. They were protesting high inequality and the corrupting influence of big money in government. Democracy itself, in fact, seemed to be in doubt. It's interesting to note that in 1908, the author Jack London published a novel called The Iron Heel, which imagined an America, if you can believe it, under a fascist oligarchy in which, he wrote, 0.9% hold 70% of the total wealth. As the public became more concerned, some of the have-yachts of that era did too. Andrew Carnegie, who was the richest man in the world, warned that left unchecked, rigid castes, as he put it, would eventually live in mutual ignorance and mutual distrust. Carnegie, of course, went on to found 3,000 public libraries that he hoped might beat back this tendency of mutual ignorance. John D. Rockefeller, who was America's first billionaire, wrote that he no longer got a thrill from every lavish new indulgence because, as he put it, what people most seek cannot be bought with money. Rockefeller, for his part, founded the University of Chicago, among a host of other philanthropic projects. He gave away half his fortune. His son later gave away 90% of the rest. And recently I spoke to Richard White, the great Stanford scholar of the Gilded Age, about what lessons that period, that transition might have for us. And he said this. He said, the oligarchs allowed people at that time to have a set of common targets. There was no common solution then, and I don't think there'll be a common solution now. But what you can agree on, but when you can agree that this is not working, this is not fair, this is not right, he said, then you get a movement. So what would a modern movement of that kind actually pursue? Well, there are many ideas in circulation, but to give you just one example, there's a nonprofit called the Patriotic Millionaires, which consists of wealthy people who worry about this kind of soaring inequality. They're right now lobbying Congress to prevent what the group calls dynastic levels of inheritance. The goal of that and similar proposals is to combat exactly what Louis Brandeis warned about, the curse of bigness. In effect, what they're trying to do is finally give the coal miner David Efaw an answer to the question about how one man came to be worth 300 or 400 other men. Put most bluntly, the goal is to nudge our culture away from measuring the most powerful citizens by length overall, and instead perhaps towards measurements of contribution to society, democracy, and history. But if you ask historians for the biggest lesson from the Gilded Age, what really pushed America from that peril into the progressive era, they'll tell you that it never would have happened without a sustained commitment on the part of civil society. A mix of public demonstrations, labor strikes, a bit of investigative reporting. Over time, that combination can dilute and equalize oligarchic power with citizen power. In other words, the key to confronting oligarchy may not be persuading Americans to give up on the old dream of getting rich. It may be to give them the facts and the stories to help them understand why they're not. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I've been told to remind folks to use the microphone, but we've already got some ringers who are ready to go, so off we go.
You've reminded me why I'm in favor of eating the rich, so thank you very much for it. So my question is, at one time, not too long ago, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett were going around the world getting rich people to sign up for giving away their fortunes. Could you give us a status report on that? How's that going?
Yeah, thank you. For folks who didn't hear the question, it was what happened to this moment not too long ago when Warren Buffett and Bill Gates were going around the world and signing people up to the Giving Pledge, giving away big chunks of their fortune. What is amazing is that actually there has been a kind of generational shift, a cultural shift. You might even call it a fashion that has taken hold in that new cohort following Gates and Buffett. They have a different view. Elon Musk, to give you one example, has said that he thinks his greatest gift to humankind is being the CEO of Tesla because of what it's doing on climate change. He has a foundation, but according to the New York Times, in some years it gives away so little money that it risks violating the law on the minimum distribution. In fact, in the first year, according to the Times, one of the recipients of its philanthropy was a school housed in his own house, in which 5 of the 14 children were his own children. Now, the reason I mention this is simply to point out that the people who dominate our cultural horizons have a way of signaling to other people in the cohort, other people who look up to them, other people who might say, I someday want to get to the top. And so it matters in a way to recognize, to talk about what it is that people do and don't do. In effect, it's helping to amplify the reality of the world we're in.
That was wonderful. And I hope you publish it, because I'd like to go back and read little bits of what you said. I mean, not the whole book, at least not yet.
I have never been accused of failing to publish at a book event, but I appreciate the point.
I'm serious.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I think and what killed the Gilded Age was depression. The question I would ask you, because I was born during the Great Compression.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the 50s, when we thought we had put the Gilded Age way behind us, and when we built shelters, and we learned how to build shelters when I was in the 5th grade, they were fallout shelters. Now, the question is, and we thought the New Deal had taken care of everything. And we're now right back. We studied the Gilded Age. It was ancient history. And we're now back where we started and worse. And there is no social movement other than Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, whom the Democrats can't be, oh, that's terrible, that's socialism. That's the answer. And how did we get to here? All the way back, where there is no social movement. The people who are being blamed for everything that's going wrong are undocumented immigrants. Ridiculous.
You know, there is a Thank you for that. And there's actually a connection between these first two questions, which is essentially what we're asking about is what happens when the people at the top have a change of view. Because after all, part of the reason we got the FDR was, part of the reason we got the New Deal was because we had a traitor to his class, as it was described. And we had Carnegie before that, and we had Rockefeller. And look, let's not pretend that they suddenly woke up and out of the sheer abundance of goodness decided that they needed to respond. Part of the reason why Rockefeller did what he did was because of investigative reporting by Ida Tarbell and others who pointed out abuses in the labor markets. And ultimately, in his 70s, for the first time, Rockefeller hired a publicist, something he'd never had before. And the publicist said, I have a great idea. You should give away dimes. And that's what he did. So my point is, the public has a role in governing, in a sense, in sending signals to some of the most powerful people in society about what we accept and what we don't accept. And I will say, I do think that Elon Musk's misadventure in Washington, in which he left having lost 71% of the profits at Tesla, having suffered this catastrophic collapse of his favorability, was a kind of education of a certain kind about the way that the rest of the country is paying attention and may not be quite as admiring as he is of himself.
I need to point out that all the people that you talked about and all of the people who are involved are all men.
Fair point. Fair point.
Thanks for this, Evan. Curious if during your reporting, writing this book, you encountered anyone who hazarded a compelling answer to your question, what is enough? What would enough actually look like? And I'm curious if you yourself have any reflections, from your own life about what enough might actually look like. It's concretely.
I'd say a book event at Politics and Prose with a group of engaged readers, Dianu, as we say. I think it's a really interesting question, and there are competing literatures on the question of, is there some threshold, some mystical point beyond which we either get diminishing utility out of money, or does it continue to grow? For a while, there was a theory, very popular, as you can imagine, we all kind of gravitated to this, that beyond $75,000, that you really didn't feel much benefit from it. Turned out the data is a little more complex than that. People still get a terrific thrill out of continuing to build their fortunes. I think what we do know, and this is both anecdotal and clear in the data, is that there comes a point when there is simply no meaningful utility. And don't take it from me, take it from Warren Buffett, who says, I have an almost incomprehensible sum of money. He says, at this point, the utility of my additional dollar is meaningless. In fact, I can put it to more efficient use, to use a word that is raised to heroic heights by people who talk about it. That putting it to more efficient use means putting it into the hands of people who don't have quite enough. I think as a practical matter, that the answer of when it stops really mattering is a reflection of this society. That when you open your social media and you see that the richest men in the world, that the owners of newspapers are not filling their time by building libraries, but are in fact organizing a wedding and having a super yacht out in the Atlantic, that sends a signal, and it changes the threshold. The threshold's not a biological fact; it's a reflection of our culture, I think. Thank you.
Hi, good
Hi,
to see you.
You too.
I wanted to ask about covering the wealthy. I mean, I think one of the things that's distinctive about this era is how, with few exceptions like Musk and Bezos, invisible, anonymous, and distant this broader class of wealthy people is. They take extraordinary measures to protect their privacy. We don't really have society pages anymore that tell us what they're up to. And in many cases, they're doing things that most Americans don't even understand on Wall Street. So what kind of impact do you think that invisibility has on how we perceive them? What was it like for you as a reporter trying to penetrate that world? And do you think the industry is devoting enough resources to doing the kind of reporting that you're doing in this book?
Thank you. And for folks who don't know, you should read every word that Osita writes. Look, there is an old saying in the world of the private wealth manager, which is that the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned. And for a long time, that was a doctrine. That was why you stayed out of sight. And in fact, people erected huge structures, legal, public affairs people, to prevent them from being seen, in effect. And then something happened. which is the celebrification of wealth. And for a time, some of these values began to move around. But what they ended up in is this strange middle region where they want to be visible to certain people, but otherwise invisible on the terms that they don't want to be seen. I discovered this when you start calling around asking people about things like tax policy and tax practices, and you get calls back from lawyers, in fact. Look, I think that there is a reality, and the reason, to be perfectly blunt about writing this way, writing this kind of essay, is that I'm trying to make concrete, I'm trying to make clear and material what is an abstract fact of our time for many of us. It's like climate change. We have gone through the last 25 years aware of this crisis in the making of inequality, but it doesn't feel real to us on a daily basis. And I thought, well, maybe if I put it in terms of steel and suede and brass, well, maybe it'll be kind of vivid. And, there's a project that I kind of take inspiration from, which is in the 1960s, John McPhee wrote a piece in the New Yorker and ultimately a book about orange juice. And he used it as a metaphor for America, post-war America, because he said, we took the machines that we used to process blood plasma and penicillin in World War II, and we've applied them to this miraculous new thing, this frozen orange juice. For the first time, you can have a glass of sunshine in January in Minnesota. And at the same time, we're also homogenizing the country, and we're creating the birth of a marketing culture. And he used it as a metaphor for America, a kind of America in a can. And I decided that in some ways, perhaps the metaphor for now is an America at sea, and that this is the way to write about it. I think I've exhausted you all. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.